He was late again, and the restaurant had already brought over the bread twice. I remember that because I was sitting with my hands folded around a glass of water, watching the butter soften into the plate, when he finally walked in with that same easy face he used whenever he wanted to seem harmless. He glanced at me, smiled like the delay was charming instead of familiar, and said he had been tied up at work. I nodded. I had heard that one before. By then I knew his schedule better than he thought I did. I knew the days he said he was in the office late, the nights he claimed he was with his brother, the weekends he said were too busy for anything serious. I also knew the shape of his lies, which was the most useful thing about him. Lies like his were never polished. They repeated themselves. They leaned on the same excuses and the same small gestures, as if consistency could stand in for truth. I had been with Adrian for 8 months when I first noticed the pattern. At first, it was nothing anyone would have called a problem. He texted at the right times, bought coffee without asking, remembered the name of my old dog, listened closely enough to seem attentive. He had a way of making ordinary attention look like devotion. That was the part that made it hard to question him. He never did anything obvious enough to be caught by accident. The first thing that felt off was a gray scarf. It was draped over the back of his chair one evening when I stopped by his apartment. He said it was his sister's, left there during a visit. 2 weeks later, it was in his car again, only this time it smelled like a perfume that was not mine and did not belong to any sister I had ever met. I noticed, but I did not speak. I had a habit then of telling myself that noticing was not the same as knowing. That changed on a Tuesday in March. I was at a grocery store near my apartment, comparing 2 kinds of pasta sauce because he had said he was coming over and wanted dinner. In the next aisle, someone laughed in a low, familiar way. I turned without thinking and saw him standing there with a woman I had never met. They were close in that easy, practiced way people are when they think nobody is watching. She was holding a carton of eggs. He was taking them from her and placing them in the basket like they were building a life together, one item at a time. He kissed her forehead before he noticed me. It was not a long kiss. It was not even especially intimate looking. That almost made it worse. It was casual enough to mean it had happened before. He saw me at the end of the aisle, and his expression changed so quickly it would have been impressive if it had not been so ugly. For 1 second, he looked like a man caught in the middle of a scene he could not improve. Then he introduced us. Her name was Mara. Mine was Elise. He said both names too brightly, like he was giving out raffle tickets instead of standing between 2 women who had clearly not been meant to meet. Mara looked at him first, then at me. She was not theatrical about it. That was the first thing I liked about her. She simply went still, and in that stillness, I could see her thinking the same thing I was. We did not fight in the aisle. We did not create a scene. The 3 of us stood there under the fluorescent lights while someone pushed a cart around us and asked where the olive oil was. Adrian laughed in a strained, high way and said there had been a misunderstanding, which was such a useless word for what was happening that I almost respected the effort. Mara and I exchanged phone numbers in the parking lot after he left, not because we trusted each other yet, but because the same lie had clearly been told to both of us, and lies become easier to see when they are placed side by side. She called me that night. I expected anger. I got tiredness. She told me she had been seeing Adrian for 10 months. He had told her he was separating from a long-term girlfriend who was controlling and emotionally unavailable. He had said he needed time before he could make anything official. She had met his mother. He had kept a toothbrush at her apartment. I listened and then told her my own version. Mine was 6 months of dinner dates, weekends away that never made it onto social media, a promise that he was not ready for commitment because of work stress and family pressure. He had said the right words in the right order so often that I had stopped hearing them as words and started hearing them as the shape of a future. When we finished comparing stories, there was a long silence. Then Mara said he told me I was the only one who understood him. I looked at my own reflection in the dark window over my kitchen sink and almost laughed, but there was nothing funny in it. He had told me the same thing. Over the next few days, Mara and I talked more than I had talked to anyone in years. At first, we kept it practical. Who had met him where, on what dates, for what occasions, which trips had been real and which had been excuses layered over someone else, which of his stories overlapped and which contradicted each other outright. The dates did not match. His birthday dinner with her had happened the same night he had told me he was stuck at a company event. The weekend in the cabin he had described to me as a solo reset had actually been a birthday trip with her and 2 friends. The family emergency that kept him from seeing me on a Tuesday had been the evening he posted a blurry picture from a rooftop bar with her hand resting against his wrist. He had built 2 separate versions of himself and kept them running until the seams started to show. What stayed with me was how ordinary the deception was. No secret codes, no grand criminal intelligence, just repetition and confidence. Just the assumption that women would not compare notes because comparison required trust. And he had counted on being the only thing connecting us. He was wrong. A week later, Mara and I met for coffee in a place neither of us used with him. We sat by the window with our phones laid between us like evidence. She had dark circles under her eyes and still looked calmer than I felt. I remember thinking she looked like someone who had already finished crying in private and had no interest in doing it again for his benefit. We did not decide to hate him. That would have been too easy. We decided to understand the shape of what he had done. That was the beginning of the revenge, though at the time it felt more like administration. We made a document and listed everything in order: dates, names, receipts, screenshots, photos. He had not been careful enough to hide his overlapping routines, and once we put them together, the timeline became impossible to explain away. That was when Mara said he would try to make us compete. She was right. He called her first, then me. He said he had been trying to tell us the truth in his own time. He said he cared about both of us in different ways. He said he had never meant to hurt either of us. He said we were making him into a villain when all he had done was become overwhelmed. Then he did what men like him always do when the truth begins to close in. He started assigning roles. To her, he said I had exaggerated the seriousness of our relationship. To me, he said she was unstable and dramatic. To her, he said I had been pursuing him harder than I admitted. To me, he said she had misunderstood arrangements that were never meant to be exclusive. It was almost insulting how ordinary it was. He did not need to invent much. He only needed to make each of us think the other was the bigger threat. It failed immediately. Mara forwarded me every message. I sent her every voicemail. We stopped speaking through him and started speaking through each other, which meant every time he tried to create distance, he only confirmed the same thing from another angle. He did not know that the 2 women he had built his life around were now sitting at the same table, comparing receipts. That was the second twist for him, and the first one for us. We were not just angry, we were organized. He kept trying to regain control by appealing to whichever of us he thought would soften first. When that did not work, he became sweet in a desperate way. He apologized more than he had in the entire relationship. He sent flowers. He sent long messages about fear, childhood patterns, emotional unavailability, and how rare it was to find something real. He made himself sound wounded because he thought woundedness would be safer than dishonesty. Mara read those messages once, passed them to me, and said he really does think he can talk his way out of anything. I said he has probably never had to stop talking long enough to hear himself. That was the point where the plan changed. At first, we had only wanted to leave him cleanly and tell him we knew. That would have been enough for most people. But the more we watched him scramble, the more obvious it became that the real danger was not just what he had done to us. It was how confidently he expected to do it again. So we planned, not in a dramatic way, not with movie-style revenge and no big speeches. We planned like women who had jobs, rent, and busy lives. We chose a place he would not suspect. We gave each other exact times. We kept every message. We saved the version of the timeline he could not explain. We agreed that no one would warn him, no one would soften it, and no one would take the blame he had earned. He invited us to dinner on a Friday. He probably thought he was being clever, bringing us both to the same place under the excuse of finally clearing the air. The restaurant was a mid-range place downtown with dim lights and too much polished wood, the kind of place that feels intimate without actually being private. He had booked a corner booth. He had done his best to look composed, with a clean shirt and that careful expression he wore when he wanted to be seen as reasonable. Mara arrived first. I arrived 4 minutes later. He stood as if he were greeting separate appointments. He did not know we had already spoken to each other about what came next. He started with the version of events he thought would work best: miscommunication, pressure, emotional overlap. He said the whole thing had grown messier than he intended. He looked at each of us in turn, searching for the familiar signs of forgiveness he had learned to expect from women who wanted to believe him. Instead, I placed my phone on the table and opened the folder we had made together. Mara did the same. He looked down, then up, and for the first time since I had met him, his face emptied out completely. There was no yelling. There was no public argument. We did not need one. The facts were already louder than he was. I told him calmly that his timelines did not match. Mara told him the dates of his lies in the order they happened. I named the trips, the dinners, the messages. She named the family stories, the promises, the future he had described to her while building another one with me. His eyes moved between us, trying to find an opening where he could split the room in half and slip through. There was none. He tried one last tactic then, the one he had clearly saved for emergencies. He said we were both misunderstanding him because we were too similar, too emotional, too invested in being right. It was a cheap line, and even he seemed to hear how thin it sounded. Mara laughed, once, quietly, without humor. I think that was the moment he realized he had lost. We did not stay for dessert. We did not give him the satisfaction of watching us unravel. What he did not know was that the real plan had not been the dinner. The dinner was only the stage. The plan was everything after it. For 2 weeks before that night, Mara and I had each separately gathered our evidence, and each separately contacted the same 3 people he had used as cover. His office manager, who had believed his late nights and calendar conflicts. His sister, who had lent him the scarf and had been told I was out of the picture months ago. And his landlord, because the apartment lease had been split and there was paperwork that did not match the story he had given either of us. None of those people owed us loyalty, but all of them deserved the truth. We also posted nothing. We threatened nothing. We simply made sure the truth reached the places his lies had been built to survive. That was the part that mattered. The evening after dinner, he tried calling both of us. He left messages that moved from apologetic to defensive to nearly panicked. He said he could explain. He said we were ruining something real. He said he had never met women so determined to misunderstand love. By then, he sounded less like a man in control and more like one who had finally been cornered by his own habits. Neither of us answered. The next morning, he sent one last message, this one addressed separately to each of us, as if he still believed customization was the same as care. He said he hoped we would remember the good parts. I remember reading that line and feeling something small and clean settle into place. He wanted memory to do the work of mercy. It did not. Mara and I met one more time after that, not because we needed closure, but because we had become the closest thing to honest witnesses in each other's lives. We sat in the same coffee shop, in the same window seat, and looked at our phones with the strange quiet that comes after a storm has already passed. She told me she was moving out the following week. I told her I had already dropped off the spare key I had made for his apartment and left it on his kitchen counter with a note that simply said, "All set." She smiled at that, and for the first time since the grocery store, her face looked light. We did not become dramatic friends. We did not turn the whole thing into a life lesson. We just understood each other in a way that had cost too much to ignore. A few days later, he saw us in public for the last time. It happened outside a hotel downtown during an industry event he had spent months bragging about attending. Mara had been invited through work. I came separately. He did not realize we had planned to arrive within minutes of each other, dressed in different colors, moving in opposite directions, but leaving at the same time. He saw us near the entrance and froze, trying to decide whether to approach. I think he thought one of us would still rescue him from the consequences of being visible. Neither of us did. Mara walked past him first, straight-backed and calm, as if he were a stranger on a sidewalk. I followed without changing pace. He said my name once, then hers, but it was too late and too public and too small to matter. People were coming and going around us. Someone behind me called out to a colleague. A valet opened a door. Life kept moving. That was the final part of the plan. Not the confrontation, not the evidence, the leaving. We did it in the exact same way, at the exact same time, in front of everyone who had once only seen the version of him he wanted them to see. He thought he was choosing between two women. He did not realize we had already chosen each other's truth over him. And once that happened, there was nothing left for him to keep.